Welcome to Follow Me to the MROP, a podcast dedicated to the journey of the masculine soul and the transformative power of initiation. My name is Brian Mueller. I live in suburban Dayton, Ohio, and I made my rites at Pilgrim Park in Illinois in 2014. I'm your host, and in each episode of our show, I'll sit down with one man who has made his rites, and I'll invite him to tell his story. This won't be an abstract explanation or a theological lecture, just a real conversation about what it was like to cross that threshold at the rites and what changed afterward. Before we begin, a quick word of gratitude. This podcast is brought to you by Choosing Presence. We believe that the greatest gift a man can give his community is his own presence. In a world of constant distraction, Choosing Presence provides the tools to help you stay grounded in the now. If you'd like an easy way to begin learning about the practice of presence, you can download the free Practicing Presence app at choosingpresence.org/app. Now, the Men's Rites of Passage, or MROP, is an experience designed to help men move from the first half of life into the second, shifting from a focus on ego and achievement to a life of meaning and soul. On this show, we just don't talk about the rites in theory, we talk to the men who have walked the path. Today, we are joined by a man who has made his rites, and we're going to hear exactly what that journey looked like for him. My guest today is Bob Colaresi. Brother, I'm really glad you're here. Thanks for making the time and for being willing to share your story.
I'm honored that you wanted to hear me.
Bob, tell us where you're from and how you spend your time these days.
Well, I'm a native of Connecticut. I grew up a Connecticut Yankee in a very Italian community, Italian ghetto. And then I joined the Carmelites, and I've been a Carmelite priest for 58 years, and I've been a Carmelite for about 66 years. So joined religious life, and it's been an interesting life, and I've done a lot of things, in my life. I did a lot of education and been a lot of development and stuff and retreat work. So that's kind of what I do mostly, in different parts of my life, that I've been challenged. And Carmelites had a way of tapping into some of my organizational skills, and I ended up being the administrator of a lot of things as I look back on life. And it's hard to let go of it these days.
Well, I also know you've been really involved with the men's work with Illumin.
Very much so. It's been one of the joys of my life. I wish I had done it all earlier, but Lumen has been a real blessing in my life. I've lived with the male communities, but sometimes we don't always share well. And I think a place where a lot of my good friends and people I've trusted more have been my Lumen brothers, here, especially in Illinois, but even around the world, because somehow we know that life's more than sports and what we're eating today and politics and stuff.
Well, great. Thank you. Let's go ahead and dive in and talk about the Men's Rites of Passage. The MROP is a unique experience. It's not a retreat or a workshop. It's an initiation. Many men arrive at the rites at a crossroads in their lives, looking for something they can't quite name. Before we dive into the why and the how, let's start at the very beginning. Bob, where and when did you make your rites?
Well, I made my rites in August, the first week of August, 2005. I had heard of Richard Rohr. I mean, I do a lot of talks and I work at a retreat house, so I had heard of him for a long time. And, and I've heard about the men's rites, and I didn't get real excited for a while, but I was doing more of his biblical stuff, but he was really speaking to something in me. But then I did finally decide to go, although it was funny as we were planning, and I wanted someone else to go, and there was a guy I was working with, and he was interested, so we were going to go. But I made the mistake. This is a funny thing about me. I read Adam's Return, and you know what? That got me nervous, because I said, you know what? I'm going to be somehow up there in Minnesota being eaten alive by mosquitoes. That was really hit me. And I almost backed out. It was really funny, but I had a wonderful spiritual director. She was a woman that's was a real big part of my life. And what happened was, and she had encouraged me, but I didn't do it for her, but she was very happy when I told her I was doing it, because she was aware of Richard Rohr and the more mystical approach to religion. And what was really funny, well, so I had pretty well decided not to go about 2 months before. I said, what the hell? I can, see if I can get my money back.
Yeah.
Well, she arrives with a beautiful drum with whatever animal skin it was. She had spent 5 weeks making this drum, and I didn't have the heart to tell her I wasn't using it. It wasn't going. Well, that got me first day. And of course, then the same thing was, and then, well, I can't look to it. But then if I had to go, and then it wasn't going to fit in my bag, you don't bring a lot of stuff. And I said, she'll never know. And I said, oh, she'll know. So I took it. Well, it blew me away. I'll tell you, I was glad it was in Minnesota. There were 80 of us guys there.
Yeah.
And the drumming that first day just got it gets the rhythm inside you. There was something going on there, just the drumming. And there wasn't a big drummer kind of thing. And I even asked one of our drummers at our parish, I said, what's this drumming about? And he said, oh, it's about you just getting inside yourself. And I said, what does that mean? But anyway, but it worked and it was really incredible. But it also was a very threatening. I just want to say this. I'll tell you, after a day and a half, they were sending me into areas that I didn't want to look at in my life.
Right.
It's the reason I went. And I'll tell you the reason I went, because when they asked you, what are you about? It dawned on me. I've been very successful. The Carmelites have put me in places and I made things work. I'm an Enneagram 3 and I'm a doer. I get things done and I want them to look right. Not that doesn't mean they're always correct, but I make them look good, and so that was all part of it. But the point was, at that point in my life, I was getting into my 50s and there was something empty inside. Everybody said, well, you got a golden and everything. And I said, but down deep, and to a few of my friends and my spiritual director, I felt empty. There was something restlessly empty inside. And so that's what kind of drew me to the whole thing. And then even though I was panicking, because I wanted to know what was causing it, but I didn't. I thought it would just go away if I just worked harder, that kind of was all about me. So that was kind of one of the issues of this restless emptiness. And, but it became, well, you could ask more questions, but it just became, I'm glad I stayed. If I had been too close, I would have gotten in the car and come home.
Right.
It got a little too dangerous, but I couldn't. And so I did. And I'll tell you, it blew me away. I mean, I still look at it as one of the one or two most powerful, transformative experience of my life.
That's great to hear. Now, let's go back a little bit to the moment that you kind of arrived in Minnesota for the Rites. What was the first thing that comes to your mind when as you entered the Rites?
I don't know. Well, Sunday we were in this little cabin up there, and oh my God, I'm sleeping in a room with a bunch of other guys, and I haven't done that for a long time, and it really hit me. And the woods looked good. I mean, I always have life nature, but there was something about what did I get into? And I was sitting there, and so I don't know what it was, but it was a certain fear. Like I told you, probably by the second day, I might have just gotten in a car and disappeared without telling anybody, because somehow I knew it was doing probably what I was looking for, but didn't want to go there. That kind of, that's something I wrestle with in my own self. So that's what it was. But it seemed good. And we had that first night we were going around and I was really impressed with what guys were saying. I said, well, okay, they're all safe, seem like safe people and good people, but so they invited me into it. I will say that,
That's great.
even though there's a guy above me in the bunk and he was almost falling through on me at the time. And I'm going, what are we doing in bunks out here? Can we find a hotel?
You've already said there was maybe about 80 guys at your Rites. Who was the Weaver?
The Weaver was Richard Rohr.
Richard was still
And
up.
Steve Pico was the elder, the ritual elder. And it was great to me. I heard Richard before, and it was great to be with him. And it was just some wonderful stuff. There's a lot of things I could talk about, but those rituals had a way of grabbing your heart and grabbing your attention. They were something. They still are. Even when I worked on them so many other times before, there's still something that those opening rituals and that first day and a half, that's probably what mesmerized me the most. Like it wasn't the talks, but it was just that. And Richard was all over the place in those days. I mean, he wasn't consistent, but I knew that part of him,
Yeah. Yeah. So was there a particular ritual or a particular moment, without getting anything that's too confidential or personal, but was there something in particular that really stood out to you during the Rites?
They all grabbed me, but there is a day of a grief ritual that kind of grabbed me more than any other time. And in the middle of it, because if you spend time in nature and some of the things they were doing, I really got in touch with myself, what was going on in me, because I was really looking for this empty restlessness inside me. What's going on here? I mean, I could count, so many things, but it wasn't filling me. But the grief ritual, and I'll tell you what really happened to me there without portraying a lot of everything, but in the middle of it, we were invited, if you want, in our small group or the big group to say something, what was in your mind? And I said, inadequate son. What were you grieving? Inadequate son. And I put my hand over my mouth. I said, I'm not inadequate. I'm the most competent man in the world. But see, it came out. It just came out once it was there. And so when we had that day alone in the woods, it was incredible. And two things happened, I just want to say. One is we were lining up to go out there for the day we had been fasting for, about a day before. And somebody came out and there was two of us. I blame, somebody there. He said, come here. And they pulled us out of line. I'm thinking, what did I do wrong? And well, the guy said, hey, you're the diabetics. So come here. He took me to the kitchen and he gave me an apple and a peanut butter sandwich. He said, I don't want something to happen to you out there, because the long hours are going to be out there. Yeah. Well, then I looked and I said, God, 3 years ago today, I buried my father. He had died. That was his funeral, August 5th. I'll never forget it. Well, that triggered something. My dad was in the middle of it, but that triggered me off on what became probably the most significant thing was that, and I just want to talk about, but when I went out there and we had some things to read and stuff, but I just wanted to be there in that confined space out in the woods, and it was incredible. I loved being out there. And I was hanging from trees, playing Tarzan sometimes. You can't leave the 6 feet thing, and watching who came and the animals and stuff. It was just incredible. But at one point, what really surfaced is I was kind of hanging there thinking I was Tarzan, was, Dad, was I ever good enough? And what really happened to me was, and suddenly my dad smiled. I mean, I was very aware the funeral, his funeral and his death. And then what happened to me was I remembered something I'd forgotten. About 3 years before that, he had a stroke, and went back to Connecticut several times. But the last time I went to see him, because my dad, I'm going to say this, my dad had a 6th grade education. They were Italian immigrants. He could fix anything, but he was passed over at the job because in the 50s, and he ran this company. He was with Stanley Works, and he was very, very good. And he ran this whole area, about 200 men. And then they were going to make a superintendency out of it. And everybody thought he was going to get it, but he didn't get it because at that time, the companies were professional. He had to have a BS degree. He was passed over. And what he did, the result was me. I'm the oldest boy of the family. I'm the second child, but oldest boy. So he suddenly realized education is everything in this country. So he'd always say to me, when I came home with 4 A's and a B, and I was a good student, all he ever said was, why'd you get a B? And he said it often enough that I began to, because I trusted my dad. He was the one training me to how to be a man. And he was a wonderful, kind guy, but I wasn't good enough. And so I really, the false self that I developed over the years was that I was inadequate. I was never good enough. And I kept trying harder. Well, that makes me messianic. My personality is, well, I'll prove to you. Everybody became a project to fix or improve or, that's why I was so good at administration. I was getting things done. I could mobilize people. And so suddenly it was there. But the last thing, what happened was the last day I saw him because when I left, I was leaving. I'd been there for a couple of days. I went and he was always either sitting or talking, but I went to his room because I was going back to Darien. And I just said, Dad, I was talking, and suddenly he wasn't in the room. So I said, where is he? So, he's probably in the community room. Your dad. So I go in there, and he's in a wheelchair with all these people around. And this nurse comes up, and she says, sir, only family in here. And I said, I'm Bob. I'm Quinto's oldest son. Oh, she said, well, I haven't been here. You're okay. Yeah. And he looked up from that chair, and he said, that's Father Bob, my son. He screamed. Well, you know what? Typical me being poor. I said, God, I'm so much like my dad. Am I going to end up in a wheelchair? Which is what's happening to me now. That's a different thing. But I walked away driving to the airport. I'm thinking, God, am I going to end up in a wheelchair? Well, I forgot it, but I'm sitting there hanging from this dad, and I remembered what he said. He told the whole damn world. That's Father Bob. I said, with the biggest smile ever. What I've been waiting for all my life. I mean, he wasn't the kind that said, I love you and that stuff. He worked his butt off for us. He gave himself, emptied himself totally in a lot of ways. And so suddenly and then I was sitting there and I was so overwhelmed. It's like heaven smiled. And then, the other piece of that, which is so hard, I couldn't talk about it for years but the universe opened up and I became one with the universe, hanging there. At that point, I had stripped my clothes down. I wanted to be totally naked before God. And it was amazing. And something ripped through me. I don't know whether it happened for 5 seconds, 5 minutes, or 5 hours, but it just poured through me. This false self I've had created and I was living from, making me messianic to get everything done. It was all about me. But it was suddenly, I was beloved of God. It just, it was so hard. And for years that kept up, this part of the hemorrhaging. But I had to get over my identity, that what I was living from, what Merton would call the false self, was that I was inadequate. And
Right.
it was the driving force of my life. And suddenly, no, I was the beloved. I was beloved of God and my dad. And it began, I stopped hemorrhaging a bit. It didn't totally go away. There's still an inadequacy inside me, the wrong things to get me. But it was just one of those experiences, and I'll never forget it. Part of it early on in that experience, I don't know how long I was out there, hours. I was hanging there. At one point, I kept, this is dumb. This felt dumb. It wasn't, it was threatening. And there was no wind, but this branch came and slapped me across the face. I don't know what the hell. And about 15 minutes later, it did it again, twice. So when I went back before I was leaving, I cut a piece of that branch because it was trying to awaken me. Nature was very active in my experience, hanging there. And I've never forgotten it. And I still go back to it. I mean, sometimes it was an experience that transformed my life. And now I have to watch it, that you're not a project that I'm supposed to fix. You're a brother I'm supposed to know and love. And all, and I think, and I would, that's a big thing. And it still struggles. There's a piece of me inside, that messianic thing was so well honed in me, that I want to turn everybody into an object of what I can do to fix them or improve them.
Right.
And so, but that kind of thing. And that was life-changing for me.
Bob, it really is exciting for me to hear about your experience and just the wonderful things that happened and that you went through on the rights. I want to keep in mind that some of the guys that are going to be listening to this are not going to have any familiarity with the rights. And so first I want to say, we're talking a little bit about your experiences at the rights, and just kind of funnily, not everybody's going to be taking off their clothes, but or
Oh, yeah, no.
swinging from
And
the
I didn't
tree.
know. Nobody told me to. I just had that urge. That was me. That's me, Bob Colaresi.
And there is time at the rights that men will be able to spend some time alone in nature. And so that's where some of that comes from. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, no, it's huge. I think, a couple of things. There was the rituals we had. There were those short talks. The small group stuff sharing was incredible. I was with an incredible group. But that time in nature out there was something, I think I always liked it, but somehow it became more alive to me to go out there. Then they teach you how to be who you truly are. And they were very participant, even the tree slapping me twice. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. But yeah, no, and I think those were the huge pieces of, when I look back, that time alone out there was not just those times, but the other times we went out and quiet and listened to, to what was going on inside me. Be still and know that I'm God. And somehow nature has a way of has silencing us and making us open to listen instead of, what am I doing to fix this or strange this?
I really love the enthusiasm you have for sharing your story. I do want to talk a little bit about expectations, one, your own, and then other guys, if they're hearing you and having this expectation that they're going to have this same sort of transformative experience that you had, or what would you just say about that, about your expectations and advising other on theirs heading into the rights?
I didn't know what I was looking for. I know why I went, which was this restless emptiness inside me. I didn't even name it the inadequacy until it came out of my mouth. But somehow through the whole process of the guys being there, the drumming, the talks, the rituals, the time in nature, that came out of something beyond me. It wasn't from me, because I would never say I was inadequate, but I knew it, that it became a revelation, an awakening. And I'd say anybody, go with no, that's why I didn't know what I wanted. I just knew why I was there. And but it was a revelation to me and to everybody else, that like, wow. And so I think is go just trusting the experience and trusting the people that are there and trusting nature. Nature is the first revelation of God. And somehow that God is going to help reveal our truest self if you just learn to be still. Our expectations get away and they become a vehicle of disappointment a lot of times.
Well, it sounds like too, you had to trust that initial calling, that initial urge inside you to sign up at the very beginning.
It did. And it was, and it's only, I remember reading something about that, but about this emptiness, I had to acknowledge it. I had been doing that in therapy and stuff in spiritual direction before, but suddenly it was there. I had to acknowledge something. Most people would say, there's one of the Carmelites always said, Bob, the reason we gave you all those jobs, you're too damn proud to fail. Thank you. Well, it's true, and suddenly I had to get through that. And so, those 5 days were incredibly instrumental for me. I still think back on them. I've even gone back and read my notes at some things I wrote after, and I've been journaling ever since then. But it's back to what was happening, but it was an awakening to what was already present within me. And I've told other people that. I know when I was trying to get some of the men at the parish going, and one of these women, well, I don't know, he's going to come back because he went to one of those, whatever thing, and a man's in charge. And I said, no, he's going to come back more the man you love. He's going to be more alive into his own truth. And later she said, yeah, why was I afraid?
Yeah.
I believe that. I think sometimes we're all afraid of our own truth.
Right.
It's so powerful, and yet that's what it's called to be. We're here to be what God knows us to be, and we have to learn to trust that. And even when I fall back and detour and let the other stuff, that demonic kind of stuff inside me, I just say, "Come on, get back."
Now, before you decided, before you came, when you first signed up for the Men's Rites of Passage, you told your spiritual director, Susan, and she made you this wonderful drum and everything. But did you tell anyone else, or was this something you kind of held close?
I held it close. I told people I was going on a kind of retreat vacation. In fact, the problem was when I came back, because, when I came out of it, and I did fly back with my friend in a plane, we had to be there, and he started talking. I don't know what his experience was, but he started looking at me, and I just started tears streaming down my face. And I said, oh, God, what's going on? And so when I came home, that night, there was electricity was off in the area of my own house, but I tried to go to the office the next morning, which was Monday. And they'd say, hey, how was your time in the woods? And I just started crying. I just teared up. For 2 days, I teared up. I was just embarrassed to see what was happening. But I'm saying, Lord, what's going on? What's going on? But it was, it's hard to go back. I look back, it feels so silly now. And
what was your conversation like with Susan afterwards?
Well, it was weird. This is a funny piece of it. One of the things that was on my home phone was that a lady I knew, her son had just died while I was gone. And I'd known her, and he was a druggie, he was trouble. He actually overdosed. So there was a thing about that Monday and Tuesday was the wake and funeral. So I said, well, I better get, I knew Tuesday had something. So I said, I'm going to go. So I went over to the church to go to the wake, and she was there, and I was talking. But what I noticed was I wasn't looking at people. I knew them all. I've been that parish for 20 years at the time. And it was really funny. And so I went over to Pat for a while and talked with her. And then I figured, so I'm driving home, and I said, well, there's Susan's house. She's going to want to know. So I wanted to tell her that drum was very significant. So I go to the door in her house, and she's, what do you got your collar? I said, well, Pat's son. I wanted to go to the wake. I can't believe it. So she's looking at me, and then, she's looking, and I said, I just want to talk. How was it? And I said, it was incredible. I don't have the words to explain it. I'm very wordy usually. And she said, why aren't you looking at me? And I said, it's okay. No, it was great. You know what? That drumming thing was incredible. I mean, thank you for that drum. It was really a gift. Why aren't you looking at me? I said, Susan, I don't know. The words are going to shrink this experience. So I don't have anything to say about it. And this went on for like about 10, 15 minutes. And I said, Susan, I got to go. And she said, don't do darn leave until she's looking at me. I stayed outside her door. She's standing at the door. And so she said, Bob, please look at me. I don't know what's going on with you. Because I do look at people when I'm talking to them.
Yeah.
And I looked up at her, and she flew back against her where her door was. There was a stairway, and she flew into that wall. I just got in my car and went home. I almost drove her. What's going on here? So this was an important piece of it. And so about 8:00 that night, I get a phone call. We didn't have cell phones, who was calling. So I pick it up. Yeah. Bob, this is Susan. Yeah. I said, I said, Susan, I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on. She said, just listen to me. I know why Moses veiled his eyes after he saw God. And I said, what? She said, when you looked at me, I looked right into the heart of your soul.
Wow.
I said, oh my God. But I'll never forget that. She always, and then later, she died 2 or 3 years later, but I remember you never told me about it. I said, I can't talk about words. Don't explain it.
Yeah.
What it was. And I said, but you helped me understand that somehow something had happened deep within me and own it, because it was very important, and one of the last things she said before she died, I had to do her funeral, remember that point. And she said, you never told me about what really happened on the MROP. And I said, you saw the result of it. Okay.
Bob, that's a wonderful story. I mean, it also illustrates for us the importance of needing some time after the event to kind of
Oh yeah,
process
oh yeah,
and wake
yeah.
up, yeah, to what's really
I
happening.
agree. I agree.
And what's changed now since you've made your rights, and it's been, 20 years since you've done that,
Yeah, it's
but,
almost that.
what are the substantive changes, the transformation that you feel like, took place, maybe because of or since those rights, since that experience?
Well, personally for me, I think I'm much more aware when I'm doing things so people will like me or I'm trying to fix them. Instead of out of a genuine love, an empty, self-emptying love. I think I become more generative, but I get the type because there's a piece of me, I practiced that for 40, 50 years. It doesn't go away. I think I'm much more aware when I try to fix things or try to figure out what's wrong with you or what I'm supposed to be doing about it. No, it's just to listen to you. I think I listen more to people now and know that God is working in them as well as in me. And I like that. So I think I'm much more personal. I mean, people in the office even said that because I had a quick temper and, things and something happened. Something happened. So, and it does. I think when I start looking at people as people and instead of a project that I got to work on, see that whole thing of reducing you to an object as opposed to being with you. That's that whole thing. And I think it's in great with the men we work with here and our mid-person councils and stuff. I think it opened a side of me that I didn't know well because I was operating out of my need to prove myself. My inadequacy was the driving force. And now I really believe it's the divine. Abba, or Father, it's the way I pray to God, that Abba is working in and through me. And that changes everything about the way I look at you, deal with you, listen to you, instead of reducing you to something that I want to control by fixing you. See, that's a subtle, it's very subtle, but it's very powerful in a personality like mine.
Yeah, and you said that before the rites. I mean, of course, you were familiar with the concept of male initiation, and you had read Adam's Return. But now that you experienced it, not only that, but you've given so much of yourself over the past 20 years to creating that experience for men in Illinois and in the surrounding areas, regions. What would you say? How is your understanding of masculinity, initiation? How have those changed over time?
Well, I think it's been great having like around here Illinois males. We used to be Illinois males, but now Illuminative Illinois, the name changing. But there are guys who are sincere and there are guys who challenge you, love you, listen to you. I mean, it's really great having a brotherhood. And I live in the male communities all these years. And then one of them one day said, "You're so involved with those guys." I said, "We talk at a different level. We don't just talk about sports and the weather or politics. And it was really interesting. And I believe that. And it's just been a real support in my life. I think I joined the Carmelites. I didn't become a diocesan priest because of the loneliness factor. I joined to have community. And I've had some wonderful communities, but lately we've gotten so individualized. There seems to be, if you don't have some close friends, you're alone. And so I think it's helped that a lot. Illumin of Illinois all these years, I was even convener at it for a long time. I've just met guys that you can share your life with and listen, and I share their life. And and I'm interested in them, and it makes me bigger than who I think I am because it was the center of the damn universe. You think you're God when you're messianic.
Right. That's a wonderful endorsement and, very much a reason to advise men to participate in the men's rights. And so finally, I'll just put a point on it. What counsel would you offer to men considering participating in the rights?
Listen to your heart and go for it, and step through any fears. There's that wonderful song we just sang at Mass. Come back to me with all your heart. Don't let fear keep us apart. I was afraid that I was nothing. I believe that. And that's all I do. And I've tried to I've convinced a number of people to go, and some have had a great time. Some aren't sure what they got into. Other people are afraid of it, because I talk too much about it sometimes, maybe, but I did. But I think take the risk. I took the risk at it, even though at that point I had terrible doubts about it
Right.
because my fear got in the way. I'm going to be eaten alive by mosquitoes out in the woods.
Well, Bob, thank you so much, brother. Really, I love you, and I appreciate your honesty and your courage for giving us a window into your experience of the MROP. Thank you.
Thanks for asking, and thank you for the work here. We need to spread the word. I think a lot of guys deserve to go on an MROP.
Amen.
Amen.
For those listening who are now feeling a tug in their own soul and are curious to learn more, allow me to share a bit about the history of these rites. The men's rites of passage was originally developed by Father Richard Rohr and was first offered at Ghost Ranch, New Mexico in 1996. While it was supported for many years by the Center for Action and Contemplation, since 2012, Illumin has been the steward of this work, preserving and adapting the rites for men all over the world. To learn more about the history and the theology behind this work, I highly recommend reading Adam's Return by Richard Rohr. If you are ready to make your rites, there are 4 opportunities in the United States and another in the United Kingdom in 2026. The first is in Northern California, May 13th through the 17th. The second in the United Kingdom, July 22nd through the 26th. And in Illinois, August 12th through the 16th. There's one on the East Coast in New Jersey, September 16th through the 20th. And the final one of the year is in Texas, which is an MROP and Umbrales, our Spanish language rites, September 30th through October 4th. You can find details and registration information at illumin.org/MROP or illumin.org/events. Additionally, mark your calendars for Awaken, the annual national gathering of Illumin, taking place November 5th through the 8th in New Mexico. You can find more at illumin.org/awaken. Finally, a special thank you to our sponsor, Choosing Presence. If today's conversation moved you, I encourage you to bring more intentionality into your daily life. Download the Practicing Presence app for free at choosingpresence.org/app. It's a simple but profound way to stay connected to the journey we've discussed today. Thank you for listening to Follow Me to the MROP. Until next time, brothers, stay present.